Guess who's back? Back again. Shawzy's back. Tell a friend. Mason Shaw is making his return to the NHL as he signed a two-way deal with the Minnesota Wild for the remainder of the season. What does his return mean for the rest of the roster as the Wild play bottom six musical chairs? That's on the way on today's episode of Locked on Wild. We are your team every day.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duhaime, and this is Locked on Wild.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we discuss the news that the Minnesota Wild have signed Mason Shaw to a two-way contract for the remainder of the season after an impressive run with Iowa over the last few games. We'll talk about where Shaw can fit and what his return means for the rest of the Minnesota Wild roster. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider and credentialed Wild media member. And we had talked about this as recently as the postcast after the Arizona game, wondering about the likelihood that the Minnesota Wild would sign Mason Shaw to the NHL roster. The stipulations were that the Wild had to do so before March 8th. Well, before March 8th turned into today as the Wild signed Mason Shaw to a one-year, two-way contract for the remainder of the season. The rates for that deal, according to Michael Russo of The Athletic, a prorated league minimum $775K, while his rate in the AHL will be $400,000. He will be an unrestricted free agent in the offseason. If you have followed the Minnesota Wild at all over the last couple of years, you are familiar with the resolve that Mason Shaw brings to the table. He has now overcome 4 ACL surgeries to get back to the NHL level after tearing his ACL for a 4th time last season. Shaw was figuring to be in the mix in the bottom 6 for the Minnesota Wild, but tore his ACL at the end of last year, which led to him not being able to help the team out down the stretch. We saw the penalty kill in addition to Joel Eriksson-Ek being out. We saw the penalty kill nosedive, and Shaw has been working his way back ever since. And if you want to look at where Mason Shaw can help this team most, Russo lays it out perfectly in the piece that he did for The Athletic today, summing up the news, is that Shaw is one of those guys who just seemed to really be a rally point for this team throughout the season last year, was a huge contributor to the penalty kill before he got hurt, and adds some depth to the bottom 6 for this Minnesota Wild team. On the same day, it is announced that Marcus Foligno is going to be out for at least a couple more weeks. Pat Maroon is going to be out until probably mid-March at the earliest. And we just have seen some of these Iowa players not necessarily light it up. So it seemed like once Shaw got back to the Iowa level and started to get his feet under him, the moment that he started to kind of get back on track, this just seemed inevitable for the Minnesota Wilds to go this route. And it is impossible to root against Mason Shaw at this point. He has overcome monumental odds to get back to this point after a really solid season last year on the fourth line. And Shaw, in his 9 games with the Iowa Wild this season, had 4 goals, 3 assists for 7 total points. His most recent game in Iowa was, I think, the icing on the cake, as he finished with 3 assists in that game, and was also a +2 for the Wilds on February 10th. Just seemed inevitable, and Bill Guerin said as much when Shaw was injured, that the team was going to look out for him and do good by him while he rehabbed his injury. So it's logical for Mason Shaw to step back in, and it'll be interesting to see what he can bring to the table for this team. The scoring was very quickly evident with Iowa once he got back on the ice. And he just adds an opportunity for somebody who has something that this team really, really prefers, is players that have a little grit and a little physicality to them. Yes, I know I used the word grit, a word that we have not heard as much here over the last couple of years, or last couple of months. He feels like a good fit for what John Hines is doing, which is to say what Dean Evison was doing before Dean Evison was fired. But if you look at the makeup of this bottom 6, look at what Jake Lucchini was being asked to do, filling one of those spots with Vinny Lettieri and Connor Dewar. Jake Lucchini has not had over 10 minutes of ice time since January 4th. And so he's playing 6 or 7 minutes a night, and this Minnesota Wild team just seems to be leaning less and less on their bottom line. You've got Brandon Duhaime filling in for Marcus Foligno, and so now your fourth line is going to feature the likes of Connor Dewar, Vinny Lettieri, and Mason Shaw. Now, I would hope that the Wild use this opportunity to not just throw Shaw back into the mix, but thus is life when it's win at all costs. But this is another reason I think we've seen Adam Beckman get sent back down, is that if you're going to have somebody on the roster that is not playing every day, and Shaw working his way back from a 4th torn ACL, means that he is somebody who is probably going to play, but probably not going to play every night. And so when you get Marcus Foligno back, when you get Pat Maroon back, there's going to be an odd man out, but considering Shaw's circumstances, you can certainly work him in to the lineup without having to play him on an everyday basis. So as much as I would have liked to have seen Adam Beckman get an opportunity, and getting called up twice and not even getting a single opportunity, considering what we continue to see from some of the regular cast of characters, especially in that top 6, is frustrating. But I can't help but be anything but happy for Mason Shaw to have put in the work and to get himself back into position to be able to rejoin the NHL team. There just is a lot of unknowns that can be associated with a single ACL tear repair surgery, let alone 4 of them. But if anybody's going to be able to work through it and put himself in position to succeed, it's Mason Shaw. So what can he bring to this team? He's going to be able to help out on the penalty kill, as Michael Russo alluded to in his article. And I think he just is going to give this team the physical embodiment of the resolve that they have been lacking through large parts of the season. He's just going to be a good guy to have around for this team, because it's pretty easy to see that the Wild are going to continue to push towards the playoffs. Their playoff odds have jumped all the way up to 18%, courtesy of moneypuck.com. A win against the Buffalo Sabres would jump that to 23%. And even though the St. Louis Blues are winning as we speak, their playoff odds are actually lower than the Minnesota Wild. So the Wild are going to continue to push. And maybe a move like this will be what the Wild consider a deadline add as we get closer to the trade deadline. That's still too far out to discuss. But my main point is, very happy for Shaw that he has been able to persevere through this, and just a fun energy guy that will be a big boost just from a morale standpoint for this team the rest of the way. Now, as we also learned today, that's going to mean that Marcus Foligno is out a lot longer than we expected. And so with Foligno out for at least a couple more weeks and Pat Maroon still out for an extended absence, we'll look at what that means for the bottom six as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Camino Consulting. How would you like to get to know someone better in an hour than you would in a year? Understanding one another better prevents small misunderstandings from becoming big, ongoing fights. After providing more than 20 years of service to small and mid-sized businesses, helping management groups navigate conflict and onboarding new employees, Camino is offering a digital seminar for families and couples. Did your Valentine's gift of tickets to the game not go over as well as you'd hoped? Get the couples and family online seminar for 25% off for the month of February using discount code LOCKED ON. Again, that is discount code LOCKED ON for 25% off for the rest of the month at CaminoConsulting.ca, or mention LOCKED ON when reaching out for a business seminar and receive your first 5 profiles free. That again is CaminoConsulting.ca. CaminoConsulting.ca. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day, or in the case of today's episode, a Locked on Wild After Dark. We appreciate you joining us no matter the time here on Locked on Wild. So Marcus Foligno is also now going to be out for an additional couple of weeks, which means that we will continue to see Brandon Duhaime occupy one of those spots on the top line. I would imagine we see Mason Shaw. I mean, if he's been playing for Iowa for the last 9 games. So I would imagine we could see him after maybe a practice or two, which would then lead you to believe that Jake Lucchini will be an extra forward for this team for at least the next couple of games. But we've campaigned for Duhaime to get increased minutes for a long time because he can be physical while also applying an element of needed speed for this Wild team. The only thing that just is interesting is I almost would prefer, just because of how he motors out there on the ice, I almost would prefer if Duhaime get a little bit of a higher elevation in the lineup. We talked about after the Arizona game, Marcus Johansson providing a 17-minute workout. while being paired with Mats Zuccarello and Marco Rossi. And if those are going to be the two guys that are taking the majority of the shots on that line, and you use the general logic of trying to provide two playmakers with somebody that can win some puck battles, who better to be able to do that than a guy in Brandon Duhaime who has made that into basically his career. He provides the same speed, if not better, that Marcus Johansson does. He is responsible with the puck, and he provides the opportunity to be a nice home run hitter type player that I think could match up well with Mats Zuccarello's playmaking ability. He's got the breakneck speed to be able to get to the zone faster than anybody else. And then your third line, as of right now, would feature Freddie Gaudreau, Ryan Hartman, and Marcus Johansson. The main point being is I think this team either needs to try to get the message across to Johansson, or they need to find another outlet to be able to provide something in that spot as opposed to just skating around on the ice and not having nearly as much of an impact as the other two players on that line. But I get it too. I do get the general theme. This is not a Wild specific theme, that because the team is currently playing well, they've won 4 games in a row. Because the team is playing well, these line combinations are not likely to change. I get that logic, but I guess my overall sense is that you don't necessarily have to wait until things go wrong to make changes. If there are opportunities to just create some different tweaks for this team. Kaprizov, Boldy, Eriksson has been terrorizing the NHL since they were put together on a line. Denny noting in the postcast that they had 17 combined points over the last 3 games. That plays very well. But think about how much better it would play if you had a second line that was capable of producing maybe not 17 points in 3 games, but even giving you a goal or 2 here and there. Having a second line that then can pick up some of the slack when somebody tries to sell out to stop that top line. And that just, I guess, is why it continues to be frustrating that we basically have seen Johansson occupy that spot all season, regardless of if he is putting together a good couple of games or is just passengering it. So your candidates to take that wing spot opposite of Mats Zuccarello, Brandon Duhaime, Ryan Hartman would be a candidate as well, because what do we know about Ryan Hartman? He shoots the puck. And so you could put him as a wing, and then your third line would be Gaudreau, Duhaime, Johansson, which is probably not a great fit either. Kind of a clunky fit together for those 3. But it's pretty clear at this point. Pick up the pace if number 90 continues to get those second line opportunities. Pick up the pace, and if you have the puck with an opportunity to drive to the net and let it rip, please do. If that ends up happening, if he ends up being able to be a consistent contributor on that second line, then the offense for this team starts to have a little more balance to it. You can't just rely on your top line to do everything for you. So if this team can get a second line to add some scoring. That's going to help them out in the long run if they want to seriously hop into this postseason conversation. But the fact that Marcus Foligno is going to be out for a couple of weeks will give an opportunity for Duhaime to have a bigger role on this team, while then also being able to work in Mason Shaw. But I'm honestly a little more intrigued as to what happens when everybody comes back. So we will work through the possible scenarios when both Marcus Foligno and Pat Maroon return. What do you do with this roster? We'll talk about that as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wilds after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is also brought to you by Game Time. If you are looking to have a little fun this weekend and head to see the Minnesota Timberwolves play or catch one of the Wild games at the XL Energy Center, or just head to a concert, let's say your favorite band is in town, or you want to go enjoy a dinner and head to see some comedy afterwards, Game Time can help you focus more on the fun as opposed to having to deal with the stresses of buying tickets. Game Time can offer you last-minute tickets, plus flash and zone deals, plus views from every seat in the venue. No longer do you have to guess what you're going to be able to see when you buy your tickets. They will show you exactly what your vantage point looks like from every seat in the arena. And best of all, you don't get hit with any hidden fees. Game Time puts them all out in front of you, so you know exactly what you're going to pay before you check out. Take the stress out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDON for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild After Dark. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day and making us part of your everyday routine. So let's fast forward ahead a little bit. Pat Maroon is back. Marcus Foligno is back. And so the likely scenario here is that once Marcus Foligno is ready to return, that Jake Lucchini heads to Iowa. That's the easiest scenario at play here for the Minnesota Wild. But what happens when Pat Maroon is ready to return? Well, also according to Michael Russo, the Wild do have the option to increase their roster after the trade deadline as long as they are able to stay cap compliant. As Russo writes in his article, Shaw's return to Minnesota could ultimately lead to Jake Lucchini being sent to the minors. What's interesting is the Wild may sign prospect Marat Huznetdinov once his KHL season ends later this month. So the Wild could soon have too many players, considering they are currently carrying 8 defensemen after last month's pickup of Declan Chisholm off waivers from Winnipeg. Teams can carry more than the maximum 23 players after the March 8th trade deadline, though, as long as they're cap compliant, which shouldn't be an issue for the Wild, with Jared Spurgeon currently on long-term injured reserve after season-ending hip and back injuries. Completely forgot about Marat Huznetdinov. You can factor him in potentially as well. But honestly, let's just look at this from what this team has had to deal with throughout this season so far. If there is ever a season to carry more than 23 players on the roster, it's this season, because you have really 3 players that have not dealt with injuries so far this season. And I knock on my desk because those are probably 3 of your most important players so far this season. Brock Faber, Marco Rossi, and Joel Eriksson Ek. Literally, I think every other player other than maybe Brandon Duhaime has missed at least a couple of games so far this season. Faber, Eriksson Ek, and Rossi, I know that for a fact because I've looked for added about 6 times. Those are the 3 guys that are definitely on pace for an 82-game season. I think Duhaime is the other. Beyond that, every other player has missed varying levels of time due to injury. And so giving yourself opportunities to A, have capable backups, or to B, not get people worn down the stretch is worth looking into. The only thing that's unfortunate is that this comes at the expense of a lot of young players that it seems like just continue to have doors shut in front of them. And now with Mason Shaw signing with Minnesota, that is another instance in which it seems like Adam Beckman has had an opportunity taken away from him at the NHL level. And you wonder then if the Wild do sign Kuznetsov, if you end up burning one of those years of his entry-level contract, it would seem foolish to do so without giving him at least an opportunity to see what's going on, what he brings to the table. And so I'm kind of wondering now if the Wilds do something to move somebody off the roster. I mean, just look at the defense. You've got, unless you decide that you are going to send Dakota Mermis back down, you've got 8 defensemen over there, including Alex Goligoski and John Merrill. You've got now all of these glut of forwards that are currently on the roster. So we're getting to the point now where there is just a bit of a backlog of players that are at the NHL level. And I would hate this to be the thing that precipitates, for instance, a Brandon Duhaime trade just to free up a spot for one of Marcus Foligno or Pat Maroon. And who knows? This could be some foresight into the fact that one of those guys maybe is not able to return at the end of the season. But it just seems to me that this is leading us down the path of the Wild doing something to try to clean this up a little bit, because there are a lot of different players that are going to be factoring into this mix as the season unfolds in these final 29 games. I really don't know what direction they go, but it is interesting that Marat Kuznetsov could really have a big impact on this down the stretch. Whatever happens with him could lead to the Wilds having to do something to try to free up a spot for him to be able to play. It does not make sense for him to just sit on the bench. So I don't know. This roster's kind of starting to fill a little bit over these last couple of weeks. So I don't know. We'll see. I'm going to be excited to see if Mason Shaw does work his way back into the lineup. What he has, we'll get a real good indication if he does play of what he has in the tank against Buffalo or even Vancouver on Monday. And beyond that, it is just a matter of the players that are playing the best are the ones that are going to play, unless in the case of Declan Chisholm, who just continues to ride the bench. So that's what we got for you for today's show. We'll have an episode coming up for you tomorrow as well. Wanted to hop on the microphone after a long day of work to discuss the Mason Shaw news here today. But that will do it for today's episode. So make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you hit the subscribe button if you have not already, so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Locked on Wild has you covered with all of your Minnesota Wild news and notes, as well as new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.